Okay, hi everyone. It's really great to see so many of you. My name's Tom Gillespie, and I convene the University of Manchester's Global Urban Futures Research Group. And I'm very happy to welcome you today to this webinar presenting research by the African Cities Research Consortium on the politics of informal settlements in African cities. So we have a dazzling array of researchers on the call today. We're really fortunate to have such expertise all in one place. And we've got researchers talking about four different cities today. But before that, I'm going to hand you over to Sam Hickey, who's going to introduce the project.
Thanks very much, Tom. So this is one of the many projects that was run within the first, or rather the foundation phase of the African Cities Research Consortium. I can see from the list of names on the screen that many of you are quite familiar with ACRC. So I won't need to say much about it by introduction. Right. So ACRC spent a few years doing political economy research in 12 African cities across a range of different development domains, and is now working in its implementation phase in a smaller range of cities. I was involved in ACRC as deputy to Diana in the first phase. I've been happily demoted to researcher status, which is one of my best career moves ever, I think, within African cities. And I've really enjoyed working alongside people who actually know what's happening in African cities as opposed to newcomers such as me. So the research team that we put up at the start and who you'll be hearing from here are the ones who undertook the in-depth work on trying to work out whether a political settlement approach to understanding the politics of development in African cities could add a bit more traction to what the current literature had been able to do. So we're going to hear from each of those cities and then come back to what we think about this on a comparative basis. We've had a couple of joint meetings as the team to check through the comparative analysis and where we've got to. So although I'll be presenting, I got delegated to present that. It's been a collective effort to pull out the different strands of analysis when we get to that stage. In terms of the theoretical background to this, there's been a growing level of interest in the politics of urban development in Africa, as many of you know. There's a huge wider literature now, and people have found the urban in general a good place to theorize from. And there's a strong interest from African political scientists increasingly with what looking at cities can tell us about the nature of politics more broadly. So there's a much better two-way exchange of ideas than there used to be. Michaela Lewis's and Tom Goodfellow's lit review gave us a really good sense of this literature. And what Patience in particular has drawn out of this for this project is the sense that there's a lot of debates around political informality, around the use of clientelism as a strategy for managing cities in a way that delivers on political loyalty. Quite a big focus on the literature on the enduring importance of ethnicity, contrary to the expectations of modernization theory in African cities when it comes to issues of political mobilization and alignment. And a few new concepts coming along to try and add value to those, including two that we look at quite closely today. One of which is Alicia Holland's notion of forbearance, which refers to the deliberate non-enforcement of laws, sanctions, regulations, etc., in return for political loyalty. And over the last few years, political settlements analysis, which Tom Goodfellow and ACRC have been trying to explore over the last few years. And what we were trying to do with this approach is really to try and address a couple of gaps that we saw in the literature. On the one hand, between the literature on formal governance of African cities and the focus on informality, which had previously been going on a bit side by side. And also, as Alison Post points out, work on the politics of African cities and on the political economy of African cities, where we have a flourishing literature on politics now, and also growing around issues of land and property and so on, but often not very well integrated. And one of the promises of political settlements analysis is that it tries to straddle both the politics and the political economy. So we started off with some broad range questions to ask that are on the slide there, of whether or not political settlements thinking could add value to this growing literature. So I'll talk a little bit about that and our research design by handing over to our first city presentation from Abdul Ghafaru on Accra. So many of you know this. I'm not going to go through the full theory. A political settlement refers to a basic understanding amongst powerful groups in society. And unless institutional arrangements deliver status and benefits to those groups, then informality will prevail. And so what we see, as Tom pointed out, is this interplay of formal institutions, informal institutions, and the distribution of power in society. And these are all features of urban governance. And so we wanted to put that into more explicit conversation in ACRC. Going a bit further, it's become a more obvious thing to do because cities have become increasingly significant to ruling elite strategies of whether it's economic accumulation or political survival. So urbanization, but also the nature of the demographics within major African cities and their political tendencies has meant that they're increasingly important for votes and legitimacy, and also economically for rents, whether that's more productive rents around industrial hubs and so on, or less productive rents around land, property appreciation, and so on. And we started off with Tim's definition of political settlement types, whereby you have different political settlements depending on how political power is concentrated. Does the ruling coalition have a strong chance of maintaining itself in power and delivering on its commitments? Or is power very dispersed, which makes it actually very hard for that to happen? We also looked at social foundations, less rigorously here in terms of the narrow and some breadth of the social foundations, more about asking questions about which groups do rulers have to incorporate or repress in order to maintain themselves, and to maintain order and to maintain themselves in power. And so we use that to select cases. So we've got a multi-leveled small n comparative research design where we took two of the more dispersed settlements in ACRC's cases, national cases, so Ghana and Sierra Leone, and two of the countries where power is more concentrated in Zimbabwe and Harare. So particularly a lot along the political power dimension there. These are all capital cities of varying sizes, but all by far the most significant political and economic city in their area. What does vary a little bit is to ruling elites is whether the city plays a role primarily as a provider of votes or primarily a provider of rents, and that varies a little bit across the cities. And I think we find in Freetown in particular that rents are available from elsewhere in the political economy, and the urban has been less significant for that. So we see it's mostly an issue of votes. But even then, as Brian will go on to discuss, votes are quite well captured and spoken for, given the ethno-regional basis of political alignments in Sierra Leone. In all cases, there's a lack of alignment between the party in power at the national level and the party in power at the municipal level. That's been the case for quite a long time in Harare and Kampala, but it swings back and forth in Accra and particularly in relation to Freetown. The next level of case selection, which was also purposive, was at the level of the informal settlements. So in most places, we try to choose different types of informal settlements in these cases which would reflect something of the political settlement in that particular context. So it wasn't a case selection of informal settlements that's comparable across the cities. These are, if you like, theoretical exemplars of their own national settlement. So for example, in Freetown, we chose one constituency, Susan's Bay, where there's a strong support for the APC with not much ethnic diversity, and one where there was a lot more diversity and where the other main party, SLPP, was actually in power. Harare, we went a slightly different way. It ended up the most interesting comparisons were actually within one of the informal settlements, and McDonald will talk to that later. And in Kampala, we chose political informal settlements rather that would help us reflect on the differential level of land values between a informal settlement based quite close to the city centre and one on the periphery, with very different land values to try and get to the interplay of rents and votes in these different cases. In all cases, we used the same methodology that we developed collectively within ACRC. Tim, Diana, and others, Beth, all had a say in the methodology that we used, and this was rolled out in all of the informal settlements listed there. And we were basically asking about the level of engagement from political actors, the type of engagement, which actors engaged from the outside, how power was organised within the informal settlements, who the key players were, key associational forms. And we tried to link this through to two main sort of outcome variables, one of which was tenure security, whether formally or informally, these were locations which were becoming more secure in terms of people being able to invest in development, and whether goods provision, the nature of the provision of goods into these settlements was changing over time. So that was the methodological approach that we used across the board. We were very lucky in that we were able to draw on bigger and better resourced elements of ACRC. So the political settlements analysis had already been undertaken, and the informal settlements domain research had also been undertaken. So we were using some of that to direct us and to top it up with a more integrated approach. So this is a collaborative effort even above and beyond the names you've got here. But let's go into, hopefully I've kept to time. Tom, and I'll hand over to Abdul Gafaru, whose connection I hope holds up from somewhere near the Akasumbo Dam. And just let me know when you want me to progress the slides, Abdul.
Okay, so thanks very much, Sam. Thanks, Tom, for sort of like organizing this. It's been for me a very important meeting. And I told Diana that I don't understand why I come to Manchester so looked for Tom Gillespie. I read his work so much. And Diana promised next time she's going to organize a meeting for us to meet. So I'm glad we are meeting online ahead of that physical meeting. So the study in Accra, as Sam rightly mentioned, focused on Old Fadama, I mean, which Tom himself and probably many of us in this room are very familiar with. Old Fadama is a very popular informal settlement in Accra for several reasons, including the fact that it is considered as the largest informal settlement in the city of Accra. I mean, a well-known swing voting city where there's also a general recognition that winning elections in Accra is important to winning presidential elections. The population of the settlement has been increasing quite substantially over time and is presently estimated at over 120,000, I mean, which is very, very significant in the context of the very competitive nature of presidential elections. We have had elections that are won by probably just around 40,000 votes. So for a settlement with over 100,000 people, I mean, you can understand or imagine the importance or usefulness of such a settlement to the two dominant political parties in Ghana. I mean, the Old Fadama is characterized by very poor living conditions, as in most informal settlements. It's been given all kinds of nicknames because of the deplorable conditions of life within the settlement. I mean, this is a settlement that has historically been deprived of various forms of public goods. City authorities, I mean, claim that they do not provide basic services to this community because it is actually an illegitimate squatter settlement and it's actually not even recognized within the map of the city. One of the biggest challenges that Old Fadama faces as an informal settlement is the issue of tenure security. because it is a squatter, informal settlement on land owned by government, of course, but with disputes with traditional authorities. And just between 2002 and 2015, the settlement sort of like suffered from 5 eviction attempts with varied degrees of success. But of course, there hasn't been any attempt to evict residents since 2015 for reasons that we would get back to. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a few highlights on what we found in Accra in terms of how politics shapes development within the settlement. Old Fadama is characterized by, a largely youthful population. It is estimated that, almost 80% of residents are youth. And this actually provides a very important political resource for the 2 dominant political parties. It is a major sort of like area where within the city where the 2 parties actually compete very vigorously for votes, and vote buying is very, very common. You see evidence of the distribution of cash, clothes, and various food items during presidential elections. Largely because of the youthful nature of the population and the perceived violent nature of residents as well. Old Fadama has been an important ground for the recruitment of party vigilante groups, popularly known as foot soldiers in Ghana more broadly, who are used to help protect the interests of political parties, harass political opponents, and so on and so forth. Another important observation that we made in the context of this research is the fact that residents in these informal settlements have often been used in a way to help swing votes across different electoral constituencies. And this happens whereby parliamentary candidates in highly competitive parliamentary constituencies in other parts of the city would mobilize to sort of like transfer the votes of residents in these settlements to go and vote in other parts of the city in order to help swing outcomes of parliamentary elections their way. Residents are subjected to different forms of recognition in terms of the pursuit of their political and social rights. On the one hand, you see significant efforts in fulfilling the political rights of residents in the sense that, even though, for example, on the one hand, the city is not recognized in the city's map, and there is virtually no provision of public goods in terms of education, water, electricity, all of which are sort of like provided by private vendors within these settlements. You would see, significant efforts aimed at ensuring that citizens are able to exercise their political rights, not just in terms of voting, but also in terms of political mobilization. So whereas on the one hand, you wouldn't find Old Fadama in the map of the city of Accra, you would see the Electoral Commission, for example, providing and establishing polling stations within the settlement to enable citizens vote. And you will see political parties expanding their organizational machinery by establishing party branches within this settlement. So you see a little bit more, a lot more commitment to providing opportunities for residents to exercise political forms of citizenship. But when it comes to issues of social rights, in terms of the provision of public services, the residents, historically have been largely ignored or exploited. Some next and last slide, please. We are beginning to see some significant changes, some differences in terms of the level of attention paid to residents in Old Fadama, and you could probably trace this to the election campaigns around the 2016 elections, when the current ruling New Patriotic Party, it's sort of like making all kinds of efforts to make some electoral inroads in the electoral strongholds of the opposition NDC. You see this playing out in different forms within the city, including the establishment of new development funds aimed at targeting sort of informal settlements more broadly. And I mean, around the 2016 elections, one of the main election promises in the NPP's 2016 election manifesto was to provide hostel facilities specifically to cater for the needs of female migrants who are largely headquarters from the northern part of the Ghana, to provide them with a hostel facility. Around the 2020 election, the vice president visited the settlement in a very unprecedented manner, because these are people who are often sort of like been ignored. I mean, when it comes to issues of development benefits. In the 2020 elections, the vice president made a series of promises to transform the settlement. I mean, among the promises was that they were never going to be evicted anymore. They were promised street lights, new housing facilities, and a whole lot of basic services that have rarely ever been sort of like extended to this settlement. And we can see some practical evidence aimed at addressing this. So for the first time in Ghana's Fourth Republic, we saw the 2020 budget statement, national budget statement, promising to build some in the settlement. And on the grounds, you see many of these changes sort of like playing the way that we are observing a shift towards the provision of club goods in exchange for political support. So for the first time, the settlement now has street lights. There had been some attempts to work on drainage systems and road networks within the settlement. And more importantly, the hostel facility that the vice president promised, and for which some room was made in the budget statement of 2020, is now beginning to materialize, because the hostel construction is actually underway. It suffered from some form of initial resistance. Additional leaders who challenge over the land on which the hostel facility was to be built. But recent evidence suggests that that issue has been sort of like settled in one way or the other, and the construction is actually at the moment going on. So in all, the dynamics appear to be changing, and this you can clearly sort of like trace to the efforts of political elites at the national level trying to make inroads into the strongholds of opposition parties. I think I would leave it there for the next person to take over, please.
Okay, I'm Brian Makoroma from Freetown. So slides. Yeah, of course, Freetown, as the capital city of Sierra Leone, is home to approximately 1.5 million population, and with over 35% of the people actually living in informal settlements here in Freetown. This area, particularly, these informal settlements are particularly located, I mean, on the periphery of the city, and are highly been influenced by political, I mean, partisan alignment, which in turn had also been able to actually shape development outcomes over the years. And the study of us, as noted by Sam, I mean, was actually conducted in two settlements. One was Douazak, which is an hillside settlement, as well as Susan's Bay. Of course, the Douazak is technically diverse, I mean, makeup, and it has actually been experiencing, I mean, significant growth over the years, and it's often highly been polarized in terms of politics, divided kind of 50-50 both the opposition as well as the ruling party often amass vote from that particular set of environment as well. But equally, Susan's Bay, on the other hand, is a coastal settlement. I mean, and also predominantly one ethnic group actually dominates within that location, which is more like Timi ethnic group, and is also a key supporter of the opposition party, which is the APC. And that area had actually experienced over the years rapid urbanization that are actually outpaced infrastructural development program within those set of areas as well. So one of the glaring challenges that I've imagined in this area is a notable absence of government support in both disaster response as well as civil development initiative over the years. Next slide, please. Of course, the political landscape within Freetown has also similarly noted in, Accra situation. You have both this APC as well as SFP. Each of these parties, had a very strong ethno-regional support base. That are contentious political landscape. And the local governments, which more or less speak to the traditional leaders, they have a much more influential role within these settlements, and they have often been in there in terms of actually addressing either disputes and also even community cohesion, and also acting as kind of an entry point for different set of development agencies or other actors that often goes to those areas. But in spite of the respect, recognition that they actually have very limited influence over political and development matters within these areas. And here again, we see that indeed the local councillors and community-based organizations, they also play a much more critical role in actually engaging residents as well as advocating for their needs within this area. One key organization that are also making tremendous strides within these settlements is the Federation of Urban and Rural Poor. And of course, the Federation of Rural Poor is an affiliate of the SDI network. This organization had also been engaged in terms of actually fostering community solidarity as well as advocacy for the interests of the residents, while also shaping the overall development, urban development processes within these settlements, not only within settlement, but even engaging other city actors in actually exercising, mobilizing resources, as well as also driving development programs within this settlement. Notably, of course, they have engaged the government agency to actually improve essential services like clean water, and also in some instances, they have worked with the municipal council in terms of flood mitigation efforts within the city. And this invariably has created a greater participation, community participation in decision-making process. And one key success again that the Federation had also caused is around the campaign that they have been engaging, specifically within Susan's Bay. And this had definitely led to the improvement of sanitation facilities, where sustained advocacy efforts had all led to the construction of new public toilet facility. And more recently, there is a Water for Peace project being funded by the African Development Bank. Through the municipal council, the Freetown City Council. The Federation had also been able to actually mobilize or facilitate those tangible improvements in terms of living conditions of the people within this area. So within Susan's Bay, the Water for Peace project had played a much more pivotal role for improving access to safe water facility, as also empower women in terms of leadership, in terms of water management, while also addressing some of the key essential issues related to water sanitation, water scarcity, sanitation and hygiene situations within those several areas. And similarly, within Boazak, they have also been engaged in a range of other self-help initiatives. Basically in terms of building resilience around for flooding within those communities. And through their efforts, they have also been engaged in drainage improvement efforts through those collective actions. And those actions are also able to actually shape the political dynamics, as well as also foster a much more participative approach to urban governance issues within this area. So And over time, disaster response has also been a very pressing issue. For instance, in 2021, there was some significant fire disaster in Susan's Bay, and that actually exacerbates a number of other set of challenges that do exist within the area, because since it's an informal and highly being clustered overcrowded, I mean, there has been a lack of access roads, and that actually delayed response, resulting in many of the residents actually becoming homeless. Additionally, within Douazak, of course, there have been frequent disasters, mostly within the rural areas of the settlement. I mean, these had largely been attributed to poor drainage systems that has really impacted on the livelihoods of the people. And of course, amidst all of these ones, it has all been part of political intention. Most times, the leaders, be it presidents, mayor, opposition leaders, often visit this place to have that kind of political attention. But most times, the post-disaster political engagements have also appeared to be highly reactive. And basically, those visits are also being based on a number of other promises without actually delivering any substantial lasting intervention within these areas. Although some government initiatives actually do exist, but they tend to be poorly coordinated and often fail to address the vast needs of these informal settlements. So in the absence of a very strong, very robust central government support, local councillors and NGOs are left to fill the gap. I mean, striving to deliver some of the key essential services and also be able to actually promote infrastructural upgrade within these areas. Next slide, please. So in sort of summary, some key findings regarding development politics in these informal settlements had actually been, one had been the neglect and abandonment. I mean, of course, often government neglects these areas. I mean, most of the key prominent, more prominent and issues of clientelism and populism, with political loyalty not actually being translated into more tangible development efforts or resource distribution within these areas. And also, it has also served as a kind of vote bank. I mean, voting patterns are often being dictated by ethnic royalty, and rather than actually effective governance or service delivery within this area. So it has been that kind of thing that had actually emerged over the years. And of course, we have seen that indeed, in these dynamics also, we have the Federation of Mobile Rural Poor that stands as a kind of primary representation avenue for community interest and as community interest. And of course, we can see that in the interplay of those political clientelism, ethnic loyalty, I mean, often being influencing, I mean, the electoral issues and the transactional nature of those local service provision, I mean, I've actually created an environment where, I mean, there have been a kind of challenge in terms of actually making a very meaningful change within these set of environments. It is also crucial to also highlight the tension that are playing, basically conflict between the central as well as local government authority. I mean, this are often hinder development efforts within these settlements. And of course, factionism and political reluctance had also impaired government support. I mean, further, I mean, also affecting service delivery as well as infrastructural upgrade within these areas. So, and in summary, we've seen that the complex interplay of political dynamics and local governance in Freetown had actually caused an urgent need for areas that often informal settlements are often being faced with. So, yeah, on that basis, thank you.
Thanks, Brahma. So we now move on to our two settlements that are more where power is more concentrated, starting with Harare. MacDonald, over to you.
I think as Sam highlighted, in Harare, we started off with a fairly ambitious ploy to look at several settlements but ended up zeroing in on two settlements within the same identified settlement area, which is the DZ extension. Now, just to start off at the level of the city in terms of its layout, Harare, I think pretty much like Kampala, is subject to vertically divided authority, and we were looking at the settlement as being nested within the city and the city within the nation. So nationally, ZANU-PF presides over the country electorally, and then the opposition runs Harare. But when you get to the settlements, it's a slightly different story. As a result of that, the country and the city and the settlements are also subject to a significant amount of polarization, which has got several impacts on various areas. Primary amongst them is this militation against residents' associations and CSOs' ability to be able to exercise counterpower. Often enough, they are labeled as either opposition if you are against the state, or advocating for something that the central state should be delivering, or ZANU-PF if indeed you are aligned in that particular respect. The city is also subject to a lot of tensions. So there are tensions between townhouse and state house. Townhouse, where the mayor resides, and state house, basically where the president resides. There are also tensions between the mayor and the governors, elected officials, and bureaucrats. There is a significant amount of political interest on the city itself, both as a vote bank for some of the reasons that have been stated where Accra is concerned, but also in the informal settlements, their existence as an apparatus for violence. So in Accra, the busing of people to go and show up constituencies that are considered swing. In Zimbabwe, that also takes place in addition to that, with violent elements. Some of the political interest that is there is also to try to arrest what is seen as opposition influence within the city. There are also, and perhaps more significantly, economic interests that are bound in the city, mostly emanating from the use of land as a resource, both politically and economically. So the city is basically subject to a lot of complexity administratively and institutionally. First, there is an amorphous legislative regime and no harmonization of local government laws. So there is often a conflict between what is used to govern the city and by implication the settlements, whether it's the Urban Councils Act, whether it's the Metropolitan Provinces Act, whether it's the Rural Town and Country Planning Act, and so on. And there is also a conflict between these pieces of legislation with Constitution, which speaks about devolution, but which is then not operationalized by way of these pieces of legislation. There is also a bit of complexity where boundaries are concerned. A lot of the informal settlements in Harare are on the margins of the city, at the borders of Harare and other cities. So some of them are not considered to be in Harare administratively, but are in Harare politically, which adds a bit to the complexity. Next slide. So what we basically did was then to look at Dzivarasekwa extension, and what we realized was that there's very little value in talking about Dzivarasekwa extension as one thing, because it is a variety of different settlements, and these different settlements differ in terms of origins and also in terms of partisan alignment. So we looked at two, one which is the federation component of that particular settlement, and the other which is presided over by what is called Neanda Cooperative. Now, the Neanda Cooperative element came into existence basically by virtue of the land reform program. They are of the locus of power in that particular settlement is stemming from central government. That is where the power to stem evictions and grant tenure is believed to come from. In that respect, land in that settlement is viewed as a gift for supporting the ruling party. There are also strong connections within that settlement and its structures of organization with ministries and other means like cooperatives, regulatory authorities, the Ministry of Housing, local government, and so on. in this particular settlement, electoral mandates are easily sidestepped in favor of shadow representatives. Remember, we said that Harare is basically in the control electorally of the opposition. Whoever is elected councillor is basically neglected in favor of someone who is considered a shadow councillor or shadow MP for that particular area. The existence of hidden power in this particular settlement is quite apparent. The structures are tied to the third Chimrengo, or the land revolution that I talked about earlier, and there exist other informal structures that in our studies we got to know are only referred to as Vakuru, which is basically a conglomeration of former liberation fighters who are not part of any formal structures, but who pretty much are in control where the settlement is concerned. There are other forms of organization that are mirrored within the cooperative, but those particular structures also mirror the way that ZANU-PF, the ruling party, is organized. In the federation component, we found that the way that they organized is basically non-aligned in terms of politics, with some respect for formal patterns of authority at central and local government level. They've gone to the extent of establishing MOUs with the local authority, which is the city of Harare, and also with central government. The organization basically revolves around what they call settlement leads and facilitators who channel residents' issues and grievances to authorities. Next slide. So what we have realized in terms of outcomes is that there are divergent paths that these two settlements take, and we believe that a lot of that has to do with the origins, which I hinted on. For Neanda, for the federation element, based of the land by the Ministry of Local Government and further by the City Council to the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation. But that particular origin story then impacts the way that these two settlements operate and the possible development outcomes that are there. For the one, the Neanda cooperative, we have seen that there's a strengthening of patron-client relations, and some of this has already been highlighted in terms of the presentations that came, where land is basically treated as a gift, and therefore the patron is in control around how that as a resource is used, and the client has got a responsibility, almost an obligation, to be subservient where that is concerned. There is limited evidence of sustained and sustainable development through the provision of services that are linked to the city. If anything, the settlement is actually at war with the city. There is a court case that got resolved in 2022, where the city was arguing that the setup of the settlement itself was irregular, and the settlement wanted title deeds and regularization, and the city was withholding those. So a lot of the developmental initiatives that we see taking place there are linked to the state to a very, very limited extent. People are self-provisioning where water is concerned, where sewer systems are concerned, and also where power is concerned. And then the ongoing battle for formal recognition by the city, which I just alluded to. There are also legacy issues that I think speak to the issue of forbearance, which Sam and Patience will speak to a bit later. And a strong sense that the state can evict without notice, as it did in 2005 through something called Operation Murambatrina, but it stays its hand incumbent on political support. And then for the other settlement, we have seen sustained links, especially with the city of Harare, but also with the government ministries that are involved in the formalization of settlements, like the Ministry of Local Government and National Housing. There is a lot of collaboration that takes place with the city to provide technical services and assistance through the provision of architects, surveyors. We have assisted with slum upgrading protocols where that particular informal settlement is concerned. In terms of formalization, there is a linking of plans by the informal settlement to the city's cadastral maps and also development plans. But again, in terms of other services beyond securing tenure, there is a lot of self-provisioning that takes place and a lot of self-help through volunteering labor to action some of the plans and to contribute to schemes that were basically used to build the settlements. But in terms of water, power, and other and refuse collection, a lot of this is basically self-provisioning, where the informal settlements is is concerned. So those were the sort of like interim findings that we came up with for these two settlements in Harare. Over.
Thanks, McDonald. On to the last case then, and Peter Kasaija is presenting on behalf of himself and Badru Bekenya.
Thank you very much, Sam. So, yeah, my name is Kasaija Peter. I'm a researcher working with the Urban Action Lab at Makerere University, and I'm presenting on behalf of my colleague Badru, who couldn't be here. But essentially, the analysis we undertook in Kampala focused on two settlements. If you can move on to the next slide. Yeah, my video should work. But from our analysis of those two settlements, what we see is that everyday life in these informal settlements is essentially built and based on political informality. When you look at the different processes around services in relation to solid waste management, water supply, sanitation, all these, as well as access to land in these settlements, all these essentially revolve around the politics of informality. And particularly important in these informal settlements, we have what we call local power brokers. These are mostly NRM chairpersons that are affiliated to the ruling NRM party. Sometimes they call themselves the community mobilizers, but we found that these were very important players in directing and shaping the kind of political informality you find in Kampala's informal settlements. They have a lot of holding power, especially given the fact that they have this ability to organize and mobilize supporters of the NRM party. They are essentially considered to be the eyes and ears of the NRM party on the ground, and therefore very important nodes in these very complex politics of informality in relation to these settlements. Next slide. Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, we initially set out to look at these two fairly contrasting informal settlements, that Chisenyi and Katogo. But eventually, by extension, what caught our interest was this market next to the Katogo settlement that we thought would be important to help us get deeper into understanding the complexities of the politics in these informal settlements. So we tried to kind of like delve a little deeper, zoom into these different cases. That is Chisenyi, which is a kind of slightly older settlement than Katogo. It traces its history way back to the 1920s, the 1930s. And in this particular settlement, what we've seen is that the local NRM leaders do not have as much influence or power as their counterparts, especially in Katogo. We've had projects such as the land sharing project, which was meant to provide a 10-year security through an arrangement where a large landhold was willing to offer his land for a large commercial development so that he could settle some of his tenants and avoid their eviction, because this site is more or less in the center of the city, therefore facing a lot of pressure given the value of the land where it's located. But this particular project faltered, never really took off due to several factors. And as I said, given the fact that it is very centrally located in the CBD, the value of the land is high, and therefore the economic rents have kind of like superseded the value of the votes of residents in that settlement. As a result, we've seen lots of powerful businessmen, especially those who are closely linked to the ruling elite, who have shown interest in the primacy of this land. They've gone ahead to use different tactics and strategies of evicting tenants by going through the landlords, the property owners, to acquire land in this particular settlement. So you find that more than 2/3 of the settlement has actually disappeared. It's shrunk to about just 1/3 of its size of what it was more than about 15, 20 years ago. So as I said, in the case of Chisenyi, the fact that the economic interests kind of like override the votes, that's the political votes. What we've seen is that the economic interests have ended up winning out, and therefore that's why we've seen a lot of the evictions taking place and the informal settlement shrinking significantly from what it was more than 20 years ago. Because essentially what it comes down to is that the ruling NRM party, whenever it comes to addressing or dealing with issues around informal settlements, whatever policies, whatever actions, interventions that eventually win out are those that are meant to benefit them as a party and not necessarily as a community. These are essentially interests which could be economic or, on the other hand, political interests. But then moving away from Chisenyi, we look at this other settlement, which is slightly away from the city center. As Sam said, it's kind of like on the margins by the lakeside, where the land values are not as high as Chisenyi, which is located in the CBD. And here, the value of the political value of the settlement has kind of like overridden the economic interest, because what we've seen is that residents have used the cover of the NRM party as supporters of the NRM party to encroach on the wetland. Therefore, state agencies like the National Environmental Management Authority it has been very difficult to kind of like evict them from this wetland, although recent events point to the fact that they seem to be kind of like overpowering the status quo, because for a long time they've tried to evict them, but it's been very difficult. But it's likely that in the next 2 or 3 years, they might actually be able to evict them after a massive exercise that was recently undertaken by the agency to evict the so-called encroachers in many of the city's wetlands, particularly the Lubigi wetland, which is a major environmental asset in Kampala. Now, going back again to Katogo, this is just meant to give us an idea of the complex politics in a settlement such as this one. What we've seen when we talked about the residents using the cover of the NRM party to encroach on their wetland, one of the strategies they've so efficiently used was to set up a small office at the entrance of the settlement, and this small office was painted in the colors of the NRM party, and this essentially acts as a deterrent against state agencies like NEMA or KCCA from evicting them. There's a lot of complex land purchase, construction of residential and commercial buildings ongoing. We've seen occasional operations taking place by rogue enforcement agents from KCCA, but these are mostly meant to extort money from the locals by threatening them of eviction, given the fact that they are illegal or they are considered to be illegal residents. Ultimately, what KCCA has in the past settled on is to simply engage in social provisioning in terms of providing a semblance of solid waste management, sanitation services to avert public health challenges. But they've tried as much as possible to ensure that they do not give the settlement legitimacy. We had, for example, one project that was implemented by an NGO, that is Rotary International, a sanitation project. And after a lot of wrangling and negotiations with KCCA, the approval was that they could only undertake a project where the infrastructure, the sanitation infrastructure, was supposed to be temporary and not permanent, because of the fears that by putting permanent infrastructure such as sanitation systems, they would be giving legitimacy to the residents in the settlement. And next to this particular settlement, as I said, we have a large, very important market, that is the Gaba market, which is a very important node in terms of the city's economy. It's a very interesting site where actually many of the residents from Katogo settlement earn their living. Many of the vendors, women, youth, men actually live in the settlement. And its politics are also very similar to the politics of Katogo, where we see, for example, many of the vendors having vested interest in the market and having connections with the State House. Because, for example, one of the oldest leaders that has been at the front of trying to secure some kind of legitimacy, tenure over this particular land where the market is located. He's been very instrumental in connecting with the officials from the State House and therefore trying to secure that legitimacy, securing a title to secure their legitimacy as a market, as stakeholders on this particular site. But unfortunately, over time, they've developed leadership wrangles in this particular market between one of the oldest chairpersons who have led this market, who was actually part of the group that started this market. But as the market has expanded, new vendors have come in. Eventually, what happened, there was a rupture of wrangles that broke out between two groups of leaders in the market, each one trying to claim power and influence over its control, the revenues, and all of this has actually affected possibilities for upgrading the market because it is facing serious challenges when it comes to solid waste management, given the fact that it's considered to be a private market. Therefore, KCC has little power over it. Apart from issues around solid waste management, it faces serious challenges regarding food safety, drainage. A lot of flooding challenges are faced by the market, poor sanitation. But aside from those challenges, the market is also significantly threatened by the National Environmental Management Authority, given its location, that this was previously a wetland that was eventually reclaimed and turned into a market, as well as KCCA, because recently KCCA was able to cordon off a small portion of land next to the market, and it might consider building another market, creating a conflict between this private market and the public market, which actually also goes against the legal statutes around the distance between the location of markets in the city. As you can see, I've already pointed this out that they have a lot of connections to State House, and this has become a very critical point where State House is in the middle of these wrangles, but it's unable to address these wrangles because the dissenting groups or the wrangling groups are both supporters of the NRM government. I've already emphasized the fact that many residents in Kampala's informal settlements, as we've seen, especially in Katogo, have informal linkages, especially with State House, the president, to secure their place in the urban economy, the city's economy. But there are differentials in terms of how much power or influence that they can wield to actually realize their interests, as I've highlighted for the case of Chisenyi, where the leadership is weak and therefore has not been able to deal with the economic interests that have led to the gradual shrinking of the settlement. The importance of informal settlements in Kampala is increasingly becoming an important discussion, especially in the whole discourse around the modernization of the city, the development of a city into an international city, a smart city. But we're also seeing that in this discourse, we also have to engage with these complex politics of the elites, the president, State House, who seek to draw support, political support, especially in these informal settlements, given the fact that they are more or less the majority, they form the majority of the resident population in the city, to try and draw them from the opposition groups. And as such, we've seen cases where the president or the elites have been very adept at exploiting events like the COVID-19 pandemic, and most recently the Kikezi sanitary landfill disaster, to try and achieve their goals of drawing more support, political support, especially from the urban poor in informal settlements, away from the opposition groups. Ultimately, these cases kind of like illustrate a level of agency of informal settlements and the ability to capture national leaders in terms of their bargaining and negotiating power. But despite the fact that they have been able to become important players, they have been able to try and exercise agency in this whole complex interplay of politics around informal settlements. Ultimately, what it eventually comes down to is the value of land and how it impacts the interests or the benefits that the elite would get from these particular settlements. Because as I earlier pointed out, is that, for example, the case of Chisenyi, which is in the city center, the land value is high. And therefore, what has happened is that the economic rents or the economic benefits have kind of like overshadowed the value in terms of the political votes that these particular settlements would benefit elites. We talk about the devil's deals, whereby politicians will actively support certain groups to circumvent compliance or obligations, or at times to tacitly withdraw and actually not enforce regulations and laws towards their own benefit. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. So just very briefly then, where does this lead us in terms of any comparative analysis? So in this exploratory attempt to test whether or not political settlements could add value as an analytical frame to understandings of the politics of urban development, I think we find some evidence that it's worth persisting with in a more systematic way, perhaps by adding in a more rigorous focus on rents. We do find that the mode and level of engagement differs between different types of political settlement, with some forms of political clientelism very prevalent in competitive settings like Accra. But we also challenge that within the case of Freetown, where the iterative nature of clientelism seems to disappear and is stretched out into a politics of neglect and exploitation. In Kampala and Harare, we find a much more sustained level of engagement in between elections because of the need of the ruling party to legitimize itself in between times. And we do sense that there's also in Kampala in particular an attempt to reach out to voters, not just on the very limited way that clientelistic thinking tells us to look out for, but sometimes more on a populist basis to the urban poor as a class. What was most striking to us was across both types of settlement that there is a growing acceptance of the reality of informal settlements, a decline in the range of evictions, and that this is happening through the modality of forbearance, the non-enforcement of legal sanctions against those who've encroached on land illegally. But this plays out differently in different types of settlements. So it's ruling party membership, which gets you away with this in Kampala and Harare. It's more general than that in the other more competitive settlements. The social foundations are important when it comes to ethnicity, much more influential in Accra and Freetown, barely registering as a factor of influence in Kampala and Harare. We also found that land values did intervene here in terms of which types of political actors were significant. So whereas where land values are low, then very local level political actors can be very influential, whether that's within ZANU-PF or within the NRM in Uganda. As soon as land values rise, then those local actors lose their power to much higher placed and better connected political actors around land deals there. In terms of the notion of forbearance, we found that it was useful not just in terms of adding a different dimension, a new political strategy in terms of how to understand the emergence of de facto tenure security within the cities we were looking at, but I think also more broadly across Africa cities contexts. What Alicia Holland's model does is give us this typology of different types of forbearance, where it's progressive, where it's reaching out to low-income groups, but regressive, where it's reaching out to high-income groups and allowing them to get away with things that the law should be able to stop them doing. And what we see in the case of Kisenye, for example, the piece has just discussed, is the direct interplay of how better connected wealthy groups are able to grab land in ways which undermines tenure security and housing arrangements for lower income groups. And what the current literature on the politics of development in African cities has tended not to show that. It tends to focus just on the strategies for the poor and less on what the wealthy are doing. And this gives us a way of understanding a more relational politics of poverty in and development in African cities. So to conclude, we think that within city analysis of the politics of informal settlements in African cities can be usefully informed by the notion of forbearance. It's barely been applied yet, much more developed in Latin American case. And at the comparative level, political settlements analysis can take us some way to capturing the interplay of elite and local politics, the interplay of votes and rents, but we need to be more systematic. And we think our work identifies a couple of distinct pathways towards tenure security and high levels of public goods provision, where competitive politics in dispersed settlements generates increased incentives for elites to respond to urban voters, but only possible where the state has some degree of capacity, as in Ghana, much tougher to do in cases like Freetown, where the incentives from rents are limited and political loyalty is assured by ethno-regional alignment. Whereas in concentrated settlements, it's partisan loyalty that offers this route to informal tenure security. On the upside, we do find that where community-based actors gain legitimacy and form coalitions with political and bureaucratic actors, as with the federation settlement within DZ extension in Harare, then you can have a more rules-based programmatic form of tenure security starting to emerge there. And there's some promise of this elsewhere with FEDERP in Freetown, much harder in more oppressive party systems. But in that setting, it seems unlikely that the state is going to be able to partner with social movement groups at the same level as it has in Harare. So hopefully that still leaves us time for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to all of the presenters. Super interesting stuff. We do have a bit of time for discussion. So if you would like to ask a question, please use the reactions to put your hand up, or you can write your question in the chat. So while we're waiting for people to formulate their questions, maybe I could ask a question if that's okay. And this is for anyone who's happy to answer it. I'd like to hear a bit more about what you found were maybe some of the limitations of the political settlements approach for thinking about these cases. So, for example, obviously the political settlements approach tends to explain development processes with reference to the national political settlement. But, did you find that, factors occurring at other scales were also really important? And so, you need to think about the political settlement as part of a conjuncture that is more kind of multi-scalar.
I'll respond briefly on that. I think we found, and this is, I guess across African cities, that national primacy really did prevail in these capital cities. That there wasn't a lot of autonomy at city level when Badru, Abdul MacDonald, and Ashley, Jamie, and Felix in Freetown were mapping who really held power at the city level. It was pretty much the most powerful players at national level, that there wasn't much room. We had different findings when you get to a federal system like Nigeria with Lagos and Maiduguri, but also with Bukavu, a secondary city. So I think there might be a lot of differences in other types of cities, but with the capital cities, we did have a variable called city level power balance that we tried to fill out, but it was so deeply embedded and didn't really have an autonomous arena to it. I personally think the limits of political settlements analysis are that we mobilise. There's 2 or 3 different versions of political settlements analysis, and I think the one that we used here majors on political and political sociology factors around the concentration of power and the social foundations, and both of those were actually really helpful in telling us what was happening. I think what we didn't mobilise in a systematic way is the dimension of political settlements analysis that Lars Burr and Bahuria and Hazel Gray have set out, which is looking at the financial basis of the ruling coalition. And so what a city's offering in terms of rents to elites, and how does that shape their incentives to be programmatic around urban development, or just to buy off particular groups. And I think if we had a metric which could tell us a bit more about the significance, relative significance of rents and votes, and of different types of rents, which we pushed at in the structural transformation mode of ACRC, but I don't think fully cracked, then I think we'd see a lot more. So I think that it's more about the being systematic in the application of it, that I'd feel that we've not yet got there.
Great, thank you, Sam. Izana?
Thank you very much for this very granular political analysis by the researchers and ACRC for making this, for creating the platform. I have 2 questions. My first question is, it's general, how does inclusive urban reform materializes in this, different political settlements, in dispersed settlements and in concentrated settlements? How differently, or how what similarities that they have in these 2 contexts? How does an inclusive reform, it can be at the settlement level, but more programmatic or universal, not only for party supporters. My second question is specifically to MacDonald. This DZ extension is very much very interesting. Me and Sam were talking about it a few weeks ago. The ones which are who get the land through their partisan connection, they still didn't get services from the city council. My question is, we know that the central government have huge power, even in imprisoning mayors and so on. And how does that power doesn't extend to force the city council to extend some services to be provided to that settlement, knowing that the central government have a huge power, violent power towards the city council, even up to imprisoning or doing so many things to the city council officials. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rosanna. So there's 2 questions there. I think anyone involved in ACRC can respond to the first question.
Perhaps I can just start on the second question and then allow my colleagues to venture some opinions on the comparative question that Izana has posed. I think with regards to DZ extension and indeed the power of the state, there are several factors. So some of the things that you're talking about that the state can use to force compliance at the level of the city have been employed. If you look at the history of mayors in Zimbabwe, since 2008 to date, we have had no less than 5 mayors within a short period of time. Mayors come in, if you're not compliant to what the minister wants, charges are leveled against you, or you are suspended or investigated for corruption, and eventually you go. So that as a tool for ensuring compliance has been there. I think what we are fundamentally looking at, where the provision of services is actually concerned, is a capacity challenge, where the city itself is concerned and the limitations of the state in terms of providing those particular services. Because if the ability to provide them had indeed been there, I'm sure over 20 years would have seen them being extended to near constituents. So rather than an inability of the central state to enforce its whims on the city council, what you have are indication of some fairly technical ineptitudes on the part of the city, and of course by extension on the part of the state itself. But I think it's a slightly longer conversation, and I'm happy to have it with you offline.
Thank you,
So,
Madonna.
was the first, I mean, I think the first question was about, I mean, my understanding of it, Izana, correct me if I'm wrong, was about how inclusive urban reforms can probably be facilitated or implemented under different political settlement types. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, I just to say something little with my observations especially with regards to Old Fadama in terms of what appears to have worked quite well or positively in the interest of residents. And I think the first key observation is more around the issue of citizen mobilization. I mean, I made a point in the presentation earlier about the numerous eviction attempts that have actually been made with regards to, I mean, residents in this particular settlement. The kind of changes that we are seeing today, the increasing recognition of residents that we are seeing today, and the shift towards the provision of club goods, I mean, which is very, I mean, something that is fairly new. You can argue are all products of citizens' ability to mobilize and resist. In the absence of those resistance, I mean, the 5 eviction efforts that have taken place in the past like 2 decades or so, you certainly probably wouldn't, I mean, find residents still even been staying here. And many of these mobilizations actually happened with the support of some external actors. And the other thing that has probably generated a lot of attention to residents there is the ability of some organized community-based organizations, civil society agencies, to be able to convince political elites that it is actually in their own interest that they pay a lot more attention to residents in these kinds of settlements. Old Fadama has a strategy of, I mean, relying very heavily on their numbers and using their numbers to threaten and sometimes actually divide elites at the national and city level. So in many cases, when there have been attempts by city authorities to get them evicted, you will see the national government or political elites at the national level actually rising to their defense, partly because of the ability of residents to politicize some of these eviction efforts. I'm not so sure if these things would actually play out in that manner in concentrated settlements like Harare or Kampala. I mean, in the case of Harare, for example, I mean, McDonough made a point that, I mean, you still have issues where residents, there have been attempts to even evict residents, even without any form of prior notice and so on. I think the nature of the settlements or the dynamics at play would probably require different kinds of settlements, different kinds of strategies in terms of how citizens could possibly be mobilized to put pressure on political elites to respond to the needs and demands of residents of these kinds of settlements.
Okay. I mean, of course, from my own perspective, the notion and urban reforms within the say that informal settlements is deeply intertwined with the city's political settlement types. Specifically, we can actually be able to ensure what we call inclusive political settlement. There is more or less greater emphasis in terms of participative governance and community level set of actions or involvement to some of the key initiatives that have been done. And one specific one that we have done as an institution was what we are definitely calling Community Action Area Plan. And that was really enabling us to utilize a kind of data-driven initiative and the community themselves using the profiling that Federation of Urban and Rural Poor had also be using, showing that the local residents themselves are being involved in terms of the collection and analysis of data relevant to their circumstances. That's definitely ensure or guarantee that indeed the kind of development plan that being developed is much more accurate and locally relevant information are being reflected within, as part of the needs of the community. So that action we did specifically within Dwazak farm. Dwazak created a kind of partnership between NGOs, the Federation, as well as local authority. And the objective was around actually improving the infrastructure, public services, as well as economic opportunities that the community itself can take ownership and commitment in terms of actually realizing the broader needs of that particular sort of plan. So the Federation also actually ensured that is that collective vision, it's more or less reflective of their own local concerns, and that's definitely had a broader implication in terms of the overall urban, governance. Actually mobilizing themselves, network, and all of these organizations through a kind of citywide forum, engaging itself within dialogue processes and advocacy platform. That actually had raised their own view in terms of what possibly can also be able to really address some of these different things. And at the end of the day, that active role that they have played of being empowered through this particular process, they're able to actually take a much more active role in upgrading some of their communities as the case will be. So collaborative governance, partnership with local governments, NGOs, and community organizations can definitely enhance the effectiveness of urban reform efforts within some of these different environments as well. Therefore, as noted within the factionalism that we are definitely mentioning, which more or less kind of fragmented power that is often being dispersed among the different set of actors, we can also be able to really, that definitely we believe that it can also lead to kind of coordination approach. And that lack of coordination among the different actors can also definitely affect or hinder the implementation of a comprehensive urban reform strategy within some of these different, because of the competing interests of the various set of groups, who in turn as well even disrupt urban reform. So whichever way, we are able to actually have that understanding as to what is there when you have a kind of an inclusive political settlement or even a fragmented one. What are the pros and cons around some of these sort of initiatives that comes up? Thank you.
Thank you, Brima. Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time. So yeah, big thanks to all the presenters. It's really great to hear about the work you've been doing, and look forward to reading more about this when it's published. Thanks a lot, everyone, and I hope you enjoy your weekends.